Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Wednesday everybody. First up, we continue our ongoing coverage of China's now years-long housing crisis, a structural issue set to remain a proverbial albatross around the necks of policymakers in 2024. Hong Kong-based The South China Morning Post reports this week that, in an effort to boost a stagnant housing market, China's local governments have been urging residents to sell their old homes in exchange for new ones. Quote, "But the call has so far yielded lackluster results, with prospective buyers fearing that poor market sentiment will force them to offer hefty discounts on their old homes." End quote. As regular viewers know, home prices are not looking healthy, to put it mildly, and as we covered on Saturday, they are likely worse than official figures suggest. To address this problem, municipalities have rolled out a new initiative called Old for New, where home buyers get subsidies to buy new homes. Zibo, a small city in eastern Shandong province, was the first to test this method back in September. Under the Zibo method, the South China Morning Post explains, prospective buyers needed to first sign a contract with a brokerage firm to list their old property, and then execute a separate contract with a developer indicating which new property they wished to buy. To lock up the new property, the buyer also needed to pay the developer deposit, which could be returned if their old home is not sold in time. Chen Wenjing, Director of Market Research at the China Index Academy, argues, quote, "This new scheme will enhance the efficiency with which home buyers exchange and upgrade their homes, thereby boosting liquidity in both the new and existing home markets." End quote. However, it is quite the sign of desperation when local governments are paying people to buy new homes. It's also telling that this new scheme has not been very popular, and that one of the biggest criticisms from netizens is, why would people buy new homes when prices are likely to keep going down? Indeed, this is what local governments are trying to prevent. Under another city's municipal model, the South China Morning Post writes, prospective buyers can sell their old homes directly to local government financing vehicles, while receiving a housing voucher that can cover up to 60% of the price of their new homes. The local government will repurpose the old homes into affordable housing and resell these to low and medium income families. And this brings us to the next development, but let's close this first one with one further observation. Quote, "Transitioning to property development may not intrinsically mean that the debt risks the local government financing vehicles or their respective local governments will increase. However, it would be more concerning if the local government financing vehicles increase land buying significantly or replace the roles of distressed developers in a way that would impact their financial burden during a property market slump." End quote. Meanwhile, Chinese financial media outlet Caixin, in a special cover story published this week, reports that Beijing is making renewed pledges to promote the construction of affordable housing. Quote, "In the latest attempt to reverse more than 3 years of decline for the country's property market." End quote. Despite measures to spur sales and support developers' financing, would-be buyers have remained on the sidelines, sparking calls to re-examine the strategy for addressing the crisis and consider new approaches. The outlet writes that in July, the Politburo vowed to increase the construction and availability of affordable housing, noting in a statement that the market, quote, "has undergone significant changes in supply and demand." End quote. We covered this at the time. The government has been building subsidized affordable housing ever since the early 1990s, when it began allowing private property purchases in the first place. But the proportion of low-cost residential units has remained small, despite a housing market boom in the decade since, Caixin explains. According to China International Capital Co. Limited, affordable residences, including those for sale and for rent, represent about 13% of housing supply. Less than 10% of Chinese urban households had benefited from different types of economic housing. But Lin Caiyi, a deputy director of the Research Institute of the China Chief Economist Forum, believes that affordable housing only represents 5% of China's housing stock. Meng Xiaosu, chairman of Huili Beijing Investment Fund Management, explains that the shortage of affordable housing has, quote, "spotlighted a weakness in the development of China's real estate sector and undermined efforts to boost the market in recent years." End quote. Meng advocates increasing the construction and supply of low-cost housing in order to boost the economy. Caixin reports that critical questions, such as how many affordable housing units will be built, how the construction will be carried out, and where the funding comes from, are still under discussion. Several financial institutions, the outlet writes, estimate that about 10 million units of affordable housing will be built. There is another critical question, however. Is more affordable housing a good policy answer to Beijing's current challenges? Some argue that the devil is very much in the details. Quote, providing more affordable housing for the poor won't reverse the decline in the country's property market, which suffers from excess supply and receding demand. It might even make things a little worse for the sector by increasing supply at the bottom end. Some might argue that at least it creates property-related economic activity, but China's problem has been too much property-related economic activity, not too little. The property sector must still contract. This will simply slow the contraction. The construction of affordable housing, however, is good news for a very different reason. Depending on how it is priced, it can represent a real transfer of wealth from local governments to the poor households that will occupy the apartments. It's not clear how big this transfer will be. If 10 million units were built and given to the poor, it would represent a one-off transfer of roughly 2 to 5% of 1 year's GDP. Because these units are likely to be rented out, however, the total amount of the transfer will be much less, no more than 0.1 to 0.2% of GDP annually. China must engineer many such transfers to put a meaningful dent in its imbalances, but local governments will have trouble paying for these transfers. They can't borrow much more, and they don't want to liquidate assets. But these are the only two main options. End quote. And that's it. Once again, the question comes down to who pays. Regular viewers know that local governments are facing fiscal crises to varying degrees, which is what we need to discuss next.
I hope you're enjoying today's episode. If you're getting some value from this episode, I only have one ask. That is to like and subscribe. This is the primary way in which this channel grows. The main way it is shown to new people is if the algorithm is happy. For anyone who wants to help keep the channel financially sustainable, which allows me to continue doing this every day, open and free for all, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. My commitment has been a channel open to all that is reliant primarily on subscriber support rather than corporate sponsorship. And with your assistance, I know I can keep it that way. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Let's continue.
Chen Jie, a professor at Shanghai Jiao Tong University Center for Housing and Urban Rural Development, speaking to state media this week, said that the central government expects local governments to, quote, explore their own path for financing construction based on local conditions, end quote, in regards to who is going to pay for this new proposed affordable housing program, adding, quote, Beijing is likely to roll out policies for funding support, such as development loans and special purpose debt, that have been used in previous rounds of affordable housing construction, end quote. Another mooted idea is governments issuing long-term special purpose bonds to fund affordable housing projects. Quote, the financial strength of local governments is the primary guarantee for the sustainable development of low-cost housing projects, as funding for local coffers contributed 96% of the overall investment in such projects. But spending on affordable housing and urban renovation projects has long been a major source of concern for local government debt. End quote. We remember from the China Update episode published on Christmas Eve, that is last Sunday, economist David Daokui Li of the Academic Center for Chinese Economic Practice and Thinking at China's prestigious Tsinghua University recently told a Chinese forum that local government debt in China amounted to 90 trillion yuan, $12.5 trillion in 2020, 50% higher than the World Bank and IMF estimates, adding, quote, without central government intervention, local debt is unsustainable, end quote. As we examine this question of affordable housing and who will pay, it's worth touching on another point Li made in his presentation, one we did not cover in Sunday's video. Li argued that there is a negative correlation between the level of local government debt and provincial growth rates, expressing, quote, an increase in debt by 10% correlates with a 0.1% decrease in the GDP growth rate and a 0.7% reduction in total factor productivity over the same period, reinforcing the negative relationship between local government debt and economic growth." End quote. He also argues that local debt must be addressed, suggesting a painful but, he argues, necessary three-stage approach. First, Beijing should absorb a portion of the debt, he suggests up to 20%. Second, the remaining debt should be restructured and extended. And thirdly, local governments should sell assets in order to pay down the debt. He says this will result in disruptions, social and economic, as well as much slower growth, but it's the best way to avoid a much more catastrophic financial and local fiscal crisis. And while we're on the issue of local debt, we need to cover one more development for today. According to new official data published yesterday, Tuesday, from the Ministry of Finance, in the first 11 months of this year, Chinese local government's issuance of bonds by value increased an incredible 24% year-on-year. This is not in a zero-COVID year. This is from a year which was supposed to see consumption-led recovery. China will likely achieve its growth target of around 5% this year. Some may ask how this is possible, but this 24% increase in local bond, that is, debt issuance, goes a long way in answering that question. But all of this debt increase wasn't to fund new projects. In fact, a lot of it was to cover existing obligations. According to the official numbers, China issued 9.14 trillion yuan, approximately $1.3 trillion worth of local government bonds in the 11 months ending November 30th of this year. Among them, 4.55 trillion yuan were new bonds, which usually fund local infrastructure projects, and 4.6 trillion yuan, that is more than 50%, were refinancing bonds, which are used to repay the principal of existing maturing government bonds. And if we look even closer, once again, the devil, in all his disquieting ugliness, is in the details. Guizhou province, Inner Mongolia, and Tianjin saw local government bond issuance increases of 93%, 111%, and 138%, respectively. Chinese financial media outlet Yicai explains, quote, "The reason behind these strong growth rates is that Tianjin, Inner Mongolia, and Guizhou obtained high special refinancing bond quotas from the central government in order to help these regional governments to repay their maturing debt to mitigate potential financial difficulties." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a great Wednesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.